Welcome to Module 4, Gender, Leadership, and Intersectionality. I'm going to be providing a separate video about the assignments for this module just to save some time because there's so much to cover in these three readings, and I just find them each fascinating in their own way. So I hope it don't go on too long, but to save some time I'm going to do that separately because it does take some time to talk about the assignment. In this picture, what you'll find is a class graduating at the University of Western Ontario, or Western as it's called now. These are all graduates of a program that began that was initiated by Walpole Island community, which is a First Nations community in southwestern Ontario, not too far, sort of between Windsor and London, Ontario. And a friend of mine, Rebecca Coulter, and I were invited to come, and Rebecca provided leadership for that program, and I came for a summer. I was at the University of Alberta at that point, but I was invited back to begin the program around leadership in First Nations communities. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to work with some friends. Some of the people that graduated from the program were friends that I had worked with in other contexts, and I made new friends and learned more about the community, and it was just a fabulous experience. But it was also an experience that illustrated the power of intersectionality. That is, taking into account both, in this case, the cultural context, as well as the gender and interests of the various participants in this program. So I've included it here because it's such a celebratory moment. It was such a wonderful program, great graduates who've gone on to do some wonderful things in their schools and communities. The authors in this module come from various parts of the globe, actually. Jackie Lumby is an emeritus professor at the School of Education, Southampton University in the UK. She was at one time the actual dean of that faculty. She's now retired and continues to work in various locations, including the one that she talks about in her article, around issues of leadership and particularly issues around gender. Tanya Fitzgerald is really kind of multi-locational. She's from Ireland originally. She ended up at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She does quite a bit of work in New Zealand and Canada and draws on all of those locations in her paper about Walking Between Two Worlds, Indigenous Women and Educational Leadership. And Catherine Luggs and Autumn Toombs, pardon me, are from the United States. Catherine is at Rutgers University, Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. And Autumn Toombs was at St. John's University in New York City for quite a long time, a really interesting Catholic university that does a lot of work around social justice. That's its primary focus. So she's bringing that background with her to the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she's now Dean of Education. Apologize for my coughs. I have some kind of a bug, and it's very annoying, so I hope it won't be too annoying for you. All right. Following on the work of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 1970, there was a huge push to encourage more women to become leaders in schools. In research that I've done over the years, the story of advocacy, political action, and strategic action through teacher associations like the Alberta Teachers Association, and most definitely the Federation of Women Teachers Association in Ontario, and at the local level, at the school level and the community level, are sobering. It was difficult, sometimes painful, but inevitably useful work. However, there was slow, and as a result, there was slow and positive change. Much of that work came out of what's called liberal feminism. And that is feminism that looked to the state to enhance opportunities for women in various settings in the workplace and at home. So in education, There was a push for more women in leadership, for equal pay for equal work, because women were often paid less than men. I know when I began teaching, men were paid more at the level that I was. Issues around sexual harassment, rights policy, and so on. And I had the privilege of working on a very large SSHRC-based finance project, actually headed up by Rebecca Coulter, in which we looked at the experience of women educators in 20th century Ontario, we called it. I was in Ontario at the time, obviously. And my part was to look to explore the experience of women in leadership. And many of those women took on many of these issues. And so I can, as I say that, I can recall their voices and the kind of really hard work that they did to ensure that these kinds of policies were in place. As I said, however, this kind of work was dependent on actions of the state. And as we found out with some of the Harris government changes in policy, those policies could be changed by the state too, and often to the detriment of women. So this is where some of the issues around and the critiques of liberal feminism come from. The other big critique that affects what we're talking about in this module specifically are that many of the benefits that ensued were mostly for white, middle-class, cisgender women. That is, women who identified as women and in terms of their sexuality were women, were female. So the difficulty then was that it was hard to justify that only those women were primarily benefiting from the changes that were occurring. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a Black feminist legal scholar. And in her analysis of a case in which, as she says, and I'm quoting here, the federal courts dismissed the complaint of African American women who felt that they had been denied access to better jobs. This happened in the United States. The court ruled that the complaint fit neither race discrimination, and we could argue about whether the courts were right here, but they argued that it didn't fit race discrimination because Black men were not barred from better jobs, nor sex discrimination because white women were not barred from better jobs. So there was no legal category for these women to bring their case forward, the court ordered, the court suggested. This tortuous logic revealed the limits of so-called identity politics and the dominance of a particular orientation, and this is quoting again, that disaggregates or shifts social problems away from discrete challenges facing specific groups. And instead, and so here we have the argument put forward that there's no room in the law for identities across categories. For example, First Nations woman or differently abled lesbian and so on. So if there aren't really good legal categories, there's no recourse within the law for changes to occur. And what happened then was that this led to significant reflection on the part of feminists and changes within feminist theory. The women's movement has essentially never been the same since. By expanding the boundaries of those for whom the women's movement and feminism are fighting for, other questions emerged. What and who are we fighting for? Well, what we're fighting often is what is termed patriarchy. That is the rule of the father becoming the rule of men in general and in the public domain and even in the private domain. So this is one of the critiques of liberal feminism, that there wasn't a naming of what it was that we were actually fighting for. And of course, other things began to emerge too in this critique of liberal feminism. The argument was put forward that we need to fight against colonialism. When we think globally, and even within our own borders, we need to think about the effects of colonialism. the effects of class, the effects of ableism, that is, those who discriminate against those who are differently abled or disabled. Homophobia, we need to be fighting against racism and so on. And it also raised some new issues that needed to be addressed. Who does, should, can the women's movement speak for and with? And of course, this is an ongoing debate. When the Women's March took place, for example, there was a huge debate within the women's movement itself about whose voices should be heard, who should be holding that megaphone, whose issues should be brought forward. And while we could debate that, everyone's issues should be brought forward, there were ways in which there was a falling back to white, middle-class, cisgendered women's issues being brought to the fore. So there was a response to that. The other is the question of what do we actually mean by intersectionality? And that's an ongoing debate, and we'll talk about some of the issues that are raised within that in the readings that we're going to look at. And how might we mediate or come to understand differing worldviews? And this is part of what the authors of these papers are working with and towards, because as you'll notice, in particular Lumby and Fitzgerald, senior moment there, Lumby and Fitzgerald are white women who are talking about non-white women in their papers. But this is, arguably this is a way to come to understand differing worldviews, and in both cases they were invited to by those communities to speak to and with those communities. So these are some of the questions at the edges of Lumby's paper. She explores the experiences of women school leaders in South Africa who are positioned as subordinate to male school leaders. Using critical theory, she explores the main ways in which these women attempt to address the discrimination they experience, but argues that these strategies may, unfortunately, further embed their structural disadvantage. That is, they are caught in what she calls a discriminatory web from which it's difficult to disentangle themselves. In fact, each of the readings today explores identity as a part of its analysis. Lumby argues that, and here I quote, being a school leader is a dramaturgical task. That is, it's one that we act out, that takes place at the intersection of personal factors and the demands of masculinist leadership scripts that women leaders are expected to follow. And so here we have, some of that balancing act that all of us struggle with. Even after retirement, I find myself struggling with this, giving up on the kind of demands that are around me. Demands from family, demands from career, demands from friends, demands from health, and not just demands, but the desire to be involved in family in a meaningful way, and career in a meaningful way, with friends in a meaningful way, and to take care of health issues in a meaningful way. And so we all strive for that life balance. But around us are the masculinist leadership scripts that create tension and push on all of these demands in significant ways. As we've read in the articles in Module 2, women's identity and their ability to do their work as leaders is subject to male norms. Lumby argues that those norms are held in place by patriarchy, understood as a powerful set of social norms in which the rule of the father in private relationships to greater and lesser degrees in all societies has been replaced or added to by the domination of male norms and male power in relationships in the public sphere, that is, in business, government, and even civil society. So we see male domination, that is, in terms of numbers, in terms of power, etc., in these public locations where women now are inserting themselves as workers, as educators, as leaders, and so on. This places tremendous pressure on women leaders' performance of their identity in positions of power across all of these cultural contexts. So how did the women participants work to position their identities in relation to the group of school leaders? Well, first of all, they tried to transform the value of what within society would be considered low status identities. That is, the high status identities were those who were in positions of power in the public sphere, and those who were in positions of some power in the private sphere were seen as having less status, and that would include mothers. And they, of course, having the experience of maternity, brought that maternal approach to their leadership and put it forward as something that was advantageous. And they were right to do that because in many ways it is advantageous. However, the difficulty with that from Lumby's perspective is that this essentializes the role of women, because not all women are mothers, for one thing, but it also means that women can only be seen as mothers if we continue to put this forward as an essential part of how we do our work. It also limits the possible leadership styles that we exhibit. So if we're not exhibiting a maternal kind of leadership style, given the context, then that can come back to bite women leaders in certain kinds of ways, particularly if they've kind of valorized that way of leading in the ways in which they've talked about a maternal approach. They also promoted the identity of women. That is, being a woman itself was not only positive, but superior to men. For one thing, they saw themselves as working harder than men. And I often hear women talking about that and, it being true in certain kinds of ways. And so these women promoted their identity, promoted the identity of themselves as women. But this becomes a bit of a mixed message because it has both kind of a positive and a negative effect in terms of their work relations. They also deflected attention from stigmatized identities. They claimed and of course this was very important in South Africa, where your ethnicity was formalized for many, many years and was attached to status in very formalized and particular kinds of ways. And from their perspective, they claimed the irrelevance of ethnicity. They claimed not to see any difference between themselves as a black or a white or an Indian, and these are the terms that are used, leader within the school setting, and in relation to those who had a different ethnicity. However, if you don't see the difference, if it's seen as not there, then from Lumby's perspective, this also disables the possibility of social justice, because if the problem isn't there, there is seen as not there, there's no problem to be solved, essentially. And the last was the denial of disadvantage. I've never been treated differently because I'm a woman, etc., etc. In this same project that I talked about before, many of the women that I talked to they would describe the disadvantage in vivid detail about having to prepare everything the night before for their whole family, make sure the wash was done, that dinner was ready and prepared for the next day, lunch is prepared for all the children. They were the one who did all of this labor in the evening, stayed up late to finish up the work that they were doing as leader within the school, and then they would turn around and say, I've never been treated differently. So this denial is one that is almost inevitable. I mean, if you focused on it, and particularly in this kind of historical case, women might not have, pushed themselves forward into these positions. But by denying the strength of of their experience, or the difficulty of their experience, it strengthens structural inequality, because again, if the problem isn't there, it isn't going to be solved. So Lumby talks about this as this kind of web of difficulties that holds them in place. The second paper by Fitzgerald is a really interesting one. It's a particularly interesting one for me because of my own experience working in a First Nations community in southwestern Ontario. And those women that were good friends of mine in that school who were leaders within the school, the community, etc. This was very much how they talked about their experience. So these voices resonate very strongly with me. One of the people that she quotes says, "I'm going to be judged on," by the way, of course, the paper is called Walking Between Two Worlds, Indigenous Women in Educational Leadership. And one of the women says, "I'm going to be judged on Western values. Therefore, I'm trying to work within two systems, I suppose. But it's more than that, you know. I'm trying to work within two systems, but I'm also a woman in a white man's world. It's pretty lonely at times. So there's the gender difference and there's the racial difference. It also means I'm judged by Western values and the values placed on male leaders. Then again, I can be judged as a woman. Somehow that doesn't seem fair that I am walking between two worlds." And I apologize for these capitals. Somehow that happened in the text box. But anyway, the quote is the same. And this tension that these women experienced, Fitzgerald goes on to talk about the kinds of pressures that these women are dealing with, and particularly how these are exacerbated within neoliberal times. So she talks about these women as stepping into a gendered world. We've talked about this before, where there's a separation of teaching and administration in large school systems. And when that happens, men tend to lead and women tend to teach. So when Indigenous women then move into these positions of leadership, they're stepping into this gendered world, just as all other women are. Globalization is an interesting one here because globalization has pushed out concerns of the local. This happens at all levels and to all educators, because what has happened is we have pushed out the local to the demands of the global marketplace. Schools themselves have become marketplaces that market themselves to attract students in a competitive through a competitive model. And in order to do that, and because students are moving around out of the local into various locations. So for example, my granddaughter is going to a school at the absolute opposite end of Calgary, which means that she is either taking a bus or in a car or both most days for quite a long time, both the beginning and end of her day, because she is interested in drama and is in a drama program in a school that offers that as one of their specialities. So we have this movement away from the local to a more global marketplace. Now this is a smaller global marketplace, but we can imagine students at the post-secondary level moving all over the world. And so we have this larger marketplace. Well, that means then that what we teach has to be less local and has to be more global. So these Indigenous women who move out of communities that are very close, that have cultural homogeneity, are now moving into much larger contexts where there's more homogeneous context across ethnicities, across cultures, across languages, across any kind of marker you want to imagine, so that the models of learning, the models of leading, tend to have less room for diversity and difference. So those who want to bring their Indigenous perspective to those schools, it makes it very difficult. They're caught between the needs of the local, their community, and systems that are driven by the global. So they're still judged by their communities who have very specific concerns around indigeneity. So an understanding of women in leadership has largely, as we've said before, has largely ignored women of color and worldviews that are shaped by different histories, cultures, traditions, and so on. So what happens then to women who have a very particular kind of cultural perspective is that they are relegated to what she calls mammy work. That is, the indigenous women are the ones who take care of the indigenous children, while under the watchful eye of both the dominant white community and the indigenous community. Um, and and it's difficult to move outside of that responsibility, for example. They're always the expert. They're always being watched for that expertise by both of these communities. And it's a significant burden for many of these women who simply want to teach. And of course, bring their indigeneity with them and want to share that with the children that they're teaching or the school that they're leading. So one of the ways in which we could respond to this tension would be, and of course many of the new curriculums that are coming out across the country, actually, this is certainly the case in British Columbia, and I know it's currently the case in Alberta as well, that we need to recognize an Indigenous Afrocentric epistemology, that is, ways of knowing, bodies of knowledge that spring from the richness of these cultural roots and inform what they believe to be true about themselves and their experiences. So not only do the students who have those cultural roots have their experience of the world reinforced and supported and celebrated, but also students who don't have that experience of the world learn from and experience that richness too. In addition, it's important to recognize and resist oppression that's resulting from colonialism, slavery, apartheid, imperialism, and other systems of racial domination, as well as patriarchy. And these women can help us in that task, but we're all responsible for ensuring that this kind of work is being done in our schools. Lug and Toombs talk about this in the context of sexual identity and gender identity, and they call their paper A Shadow of Ourselves, Identity Erasure, and the Politics of Queer Leadership. And in this article, the authors explore issues of identity as well, particularly gender identity and sexual orientation. And each of these stand in tension with professional norms. They use the example of the St. John's suit, and here we have an example of the St. John's suit in case you were wondering what it looks like, as a kind of avatar for the professional norms that shape women leaders' identities, either in conformity to or in resistance to its demands. The St. John's suit was an expectation in this particular board for women in positions of leadership, as well as well-coiffed hair, manicured gel nails, and a preferred manner of self-presentation, including the way they spoke, the way they sat, the way they presented themselves in social situations, and so on. And if you wanted to be a leader within that board as a woman, that was how you presented yourself. So what happens if that just simply isn't a comfortable mode of self-presentation? Well, the authors compare the suit to the panopticon, a concept originally of Jeremy Bentham's many centuries ago, actually, in which a prison became self-regulated, according to his model, because the person who was in the tower or wasn't in the tower had the power to punish any kind of aberrant behavior or behavior that was not okay. That were in these various cells. So this person in the center could look at them at any time and see what was happening. But they couldn't see, because they were shielded by a special kind of material, they couldn't see whether that person was there or not. And there was always a light that was shining into their cells. So what happened as a result of this arrangement, the prisoners self-disciplined their activities because they were fearful of the watchful but unseen eye, because that person in the tower could actually censure them and they could be punished for various kinds of behavior. So this person had what Foucault calls disciplinary power. Foucault argued that this is a much more powerful way to organize society than the power of kings and queens, as there's not enough armed soldiers in the empire's command to fully discipline an unruly society. So the disciplinary power of social and political censure was much more efficient and powerful because people regulate themselves. In the generally speaking, and you need a smaller force to take care of the people that don't, but generally speaking, society will take care of itself by regulating itself. In the anecdote then, the suit signified positional power because it also made the wearer visible at all times to the disciplinary gaze of the director. The director knew who those leaders were because of the ways in which they were self-presenting, especially in a context where the community did not match that level of self-presentation for various kinds of reasons. The wearer signified leadership by a particular presentation of self centered on clothes, hairstyle, weight, race, and supposed sexual orientation to pass as a real educational leader. So the suit became the marker of insiders and outsiders. So that became panoptical power. Identity then equaled a series of frameworks or suits. And so identity in this sense then means that you don different frameworks, or you present yourself in different ways, in different contexts and for different reasons. We socially construct which suits or which identity to wear and when to wear them, depending on social context. So, you're at a social gathering with friends, you may act very differently than meet the teacher night, for example. You dress differently, you present yourself differently, you talk differently, you don't use certain words, etc. The decision about which identity to wear may be due to political pressure or your own political astuteness, and even assimilation into, you become convinced that this is the way it should be over a period of time. So if identity always needs to be on, then negotiating a false identity can be debilitating. And for principals, you're always on. Your identity is something that you carry with you at all times. So if you're wearing a false identity all the time, that is one that is very antithetical to how you actually feel yourself to be, then this can be very debilitating. Historically, school leaders are observed through both sexist and heterosexist lens. They are expected to be male, and they are expected to be heterosexual. But if the applicant or the actual person in the job doesn't fit, that has implications. So they then propose a kind of model of queer leadership, what they call queer leadership, and they explicate why they use the term queer. So queer leaders, they say, and from those that I've talked to over many years, this is exactly what has happened, in particular at those times when being queer was frowned on and could have actually been dangerous. They used identity management strategies. So they would dress in a particular kind of way that would be very different than how they would present themselves in other locations. Their office decor had to be very carefully monitored. You wouldn't have a picture of your same-sex partner, for example, like a heterosexual male or female would have pictures of their different sex partner. And objects were carefully monitored as well. Nothing could be too gay, so to speak. And this whole notion of don't ask, don't tell was often followed, which, means that a whole area of your life couldn't be talked about. They were extremely vulnerable until tenured, and even after that were vulnerable as well. Even when the laws changed in certain contexts, they were extremely vulnerable. This kind of situation, as you can imagine, is exhausting, it's very awkward, and it's potentially dangerous. Students who are from using their language are queer, who are LGBTQ, and teachers are subject to harassment, bullying, and even violence if their sexual identity becomes known. School leaders and staff are not always proactive in resisting these behaviors, and there's lots of articles, some of which I've listed actually in the supplementary readings that you can have a look at. It talks about the ways in which the language, like, you're such a fag, that sort of thing, and protection of those who are being bullied because of their sexual identity often just is not taken care of in schools. And legal rights, as we've said before, are tenuous. They're there now, but they can be taken away. And so you're always kind of depending on the largesse of the state, so to speak. So what's a leader to do? Well, stop all forms of teasing, bullying, and harassment. And ask, do queer students, teachers, administrators see themselves in the curriculum and personnel policies and everyday interactions? And to reflect about your own values, beliefs, and attitudes and how they're enacted in schools. And if we do those things, we will see change. And all of those things are important. So this video has been lengthy. I think the work that these papers represent is important in thinking about the various contexts in which we find ourselves in schools, and the various needs of our students, our communities, and our community members. And so I urge you to read them carefully and to think carefully about their meaning in your own personal and professional life. And I'll look forward to the forum. Thanks very much.